Alright, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the Lighthouse report. I hope you guys are having a great time as usual reading through the report, diving through every section, whether it may be trade finance, adoption, legal, macroeconomics, or whatever. So in this month's rabbit hole, we went over some operations in DLT that aren't quite as talked about, largely because they're not directly involved in the crypto markets, but they're arguably the foundations of what's really building behind blockchain utility in our economy. So we mentioned things like R3 with how they got started as a consortium, and then some use cases behind Corda that we've seen. We then also talked a bit about Hyperledger with what they're doing, along with some of the case studies that we've seen from them, with some of their members within their foundation utilizing various different products of theirs. Then we also looked a little further into INAPA and kind of the work and events that they've been related to blockchain regulations and standardization. And then finally we touched up a little more on LackChain and really tied a lot of these entities together that we've discussed upon. And so as usual, this video will just be a little supplement to everything we've covered in addition to some other goods. So to start off, let's just run through the R3 timeline with a little more detail. So the story all starts back in 2014 when the three founders of R3, David Rudder, Tom McDonald, and Jesse Edwards. And as we can see, each of them had previously also had some experience within the world of finance already. And that makes sense with how R3 was initially formed as a banking consortium. So the initial goal of this idea was to have a connected network in the financial sector that required less trust between each other and instead trusting a decentralized network where transactions would be far more efficient and operate much more effectively than the current correspondent banking networks. And soon enough, 9 large banks all joined in, with those being JP Morgan, State Street, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, UBS, and a couple others that were mentioned in the report. So with that level of backing, you can be pretty confident that your startup will do just fine. I mean, these are some of the biggest players in the world of finance after all. And so with this, they eventually went from a rather closed banking consortium to evolving into a software company focused on creating enterprise-grade technology for industry use cases. After a little further developing, they launched the world's first permissioned DLT platform, Corda. And this was really attractive and innovative to the world of enterprises, as around this time there was a whole lot of talk around blockchain and DLT like there are today, but there wasn't anything seriously enterprise built and permission focused like Corda was. Then they decided to come out with a Series A funding round, which actually resulted in being the largest ever DLT investment, in where they secured over $107 million from, again, some of the largest financial institutions in the world. And in this image we can actually see some of who their investors are, pretty much big investment banks from all around the world, right? We see ones native to America where R3 was founded, like BNY Mellon, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. And then we see some other international giants like UBS, BNP Paribas, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, etc. And well, since then, they've done a ton more work around collaborating with members in the industry, in addition to working with some other intergovernmental organizations and public sector standard-setting bodies at things like test CBDC trials with the Bank for International Settlements, with Project Jura and other Bank for International Settlements projects, in addition to just other central banks such as the Bank of Canada with their Project Jasper. And then there's them working with Six Group to have the Six Digital Exchange SDX live on Corda, and then collaborating with the DTCC for their Project Ion platform, which is largely focused on settlements on a DLT, and they of course are leveraging R3's Corda for this mission. And then here we can see some of their clients that are actually using Corda, and well, we also see industry leaders and household names as their clients here, from guys like NASDAQ, SDX, SAP, Accenture, etc. So R3 has come quite a long way from where they've started. Though again, if you have that much backing behind you, it definitely makes it a little easier to be able to attract more clients of that caliber to accelerate the adoption of your ecosystem. But now, something that's a little more or less known about R3 is that Corda isn't actually their only product. They've also got a confidential computing platform titled Conclave. Pretty much what this is a platform that's focused on data sharing of proprietary private data. Now, why would you share your private data though? Well, when it's used and analyzed in a shared aggregated manner, it actually becomes a very useful tool of say 10 firms sharing their proprietary data, which really gives a broader scope of analytics within that specific industry versus data from just one of many firms. But because this data is technically meant to be kept private, there needs to be some way to hide that from the other companies, right? Well, that's where the encryption behind Conclave comes in. And so there's two parts to Conclave. The cloud computing platform side that stores the data in addition to having pre-built privacy features. And then there's the Conclave core side, which is the application layer to actually utilize the proprietary data. We've also seen some of these similar use cases in the world of crypto in the form of ZK rollups or smart multi-party computation, where users can verify credentials and information without exactly having to reveal all their data. Conclave kind of works similarly, just more so in an enterprise focus and analytics sense. Now let's move on from Corda and discuss a little more about Hyperledger, Inappa, and LackChain, since they're all kind of interconnected in a sense. So we had a pretty basic rundown of Hyperledger and what they do, and being a nonprofit organization that's founded by the Linux Foundation, along with some of the case studies that they've done. But let's look a little further into their plethora of projects. So these are just their graduated projects here, and then in this little section I just gave a brief summary of where their other developing and incubating projects would fit under. So we can see with the graduated projects, there's Hyperledger Aries, which is basically an interoperable toolkit to store and connect digital credentials in a peer-to-peer interaction kind of manner. Then there's Hyperledger Besu, which is actually an Ethereum client that's built to be more enterprise focused through support for several consensus mechanisms while being permissioned. Then there's their most popular product, Hyperledger Fabric. This is a network for general industry purposes, so think things like supply chain procurement, settling and clearing assets, loyalty and reward programs, etc. Hyperledger Indy. This is basically a library for storing digital credentials with built-in interoperability. Hyperledger Iroha is specifically made as an easy plug-and-play tool for IoT infrastructure projects that need DLT for their operations, and it also runs with a crash fault tolerant algorithm. And finally, Sawtooth, which is for deploying and running blockchains and giving smart contracts specific parameters in a business setting, while also being practical Byzantine fault tolerant. And now in this infographic here, we can see a large portion of the members that are actually in the Hyperledger Foundation, which is basically a global coordination to build and adopt this technology. And in this infographic that I made, we can see that with fintech players such as Quant, Ripple, and R3, tech giants like IBM, Tencent, Oracle, academias like MIT and Portland State University, and then other consortiums like MOBI, the Digital Chamber of Commerce, Alastria, Interwork Alliance, and many more. Alright, but since we're on the topic of consortiums and global alliances, let's look at Inappa and LackChain now. So as we discussed, these guys are all technically interconnected together, with LackChain actually using Hyperledger Besu for their initiative of building a public permission network all around Latin America and the Caribbeans. So on Inappa's end, they're working with some of the top industry leaders around the world to find a method for blockchain and DLT to come into industry adoption, while working with policymakers to ensure it's the best suited framework. And we've seen them working closely around the EU's MiCA bill and having them even form a task force around it. And in addition to this, we've seen Inappa also host webinars and conversations with some of the most influential members in the space around SWIFT, the European Commission, Accenture, the World Bank, and everything else around that caliber of authority. Now, something that's a little less known is that Inappa actually has their own license committee to ISO TC307. So this is the ISO standard for blockchain and distributed ledgers, founded by Quant CEO Gilbert Verdian, right? And this is directly from the ISO site, as we can see. And the contact email here for the INAPA license group is actually directly Gilbert himself. But we also know that LackChain has been adopting this standard from their work with Quant, in addition to the work that they've done with INAPA. But also the fact that we know Hyperledger has shown their support for adopting both ISO TC307 and SATP, which, as seen here, is the other standard Quant's been working on with MIT for API gateways to be the main form of DLT interoperability. So the 5 members on this panel were highlighted for an International Telecommunications Union webinar to basically discuss blockchain interoperability, and as we can see, there's members from Consensus, Accenture, Hyperledger, ISO, Quant, INAPA. And this is an older document dating back to 2020 between the UN CFACT and ISO on a paper to have global interoperability between the world of agri-food. And up here we see a diagram of an example of universal farm compliance of on and off-chain data, with this actually being made by the ISO TC307 group. And now, as we can see, both the co-presenters' LinkedIn pages are here, and what we see is that they're both directly also ISO members, with Pankari being a blockchain and AI expert, so likely some links to ISO TC307 with the fact that it's focused on blockchain, and also ISO TC307 having a license committee to artificial intelligence. So that fits their position pretty well. We see that she's also holding a very similar position at the United Nations, which makes sense as this is a United Nations presentation in addition to the ITU being a UN specialized group. And then some experience at JP Morgan a little over a year after joining ISO and the UN, which might not say much but should kind of make you think that after working for a year in these massive standard setting bodies around blockchain and AI, what must they be doing at JP Morgan as a blockchain researcher? The other member in this presentation is Fiona Delaney. She's actually the CEO of Origin Chain, the project being discussed in the showcase. And we can see some experience at ISO in TC307 along with TC729, which is for innovations management. So they kind of go hand in hand. Now, she was also a co-editor for 2 other standards, TR3242 and TR6277. The TR basically stands for technical reports, and as we can see, both the technical committees for these standards, of course, tie back to ISO TC307. And now to finish it off, let's go all the way back to 2017 when Standards Australia published this paper of blockchain standardization. So in here, multiple standards are mentioned, but the main thing being discussed is TC307, as Australia is the secretariat of the standard, and of course we see Mr. Gilbert Verding being mentioned in here along with their statement of how important it will be for global cooperation to see the success of ISO TC307. And now 2 very interesting points here is that it states and acknowledges that there's other Australian and international standards that may potentially have some overlap with TC307 and might even help with the rollout of blockchains. And one standard we see here is ISO 2022, the new standard for financial messages. Now this is interesting because there's been a lot of argument and maybe even FUD going on in the retail communities about how something may be TC307 compliant or not 20022 compliant, or vice versa. Well, here we can see that they actually kind of work and harmonize together, and if anyone is curious to learn more on that, I did previously have an interview with an ISO TC307 license member for the Smart Contract Working Group a while back, Ismail Ribas, on my channel to further explain the confusion and everything else TC307, so check that out if you're interested for more. But in this document, we also see a graph of government-related services that a sample survey have said would like see using blockchain for more efficiency, such as transferring bills of lading, health records, identities, stimulus, etc. And these are all things that are still being talked about more and more in today's environment, so you could argue that they were pretty ahead with this stuff. Now, to finish it off, take a look at the participating members within this report. We can see that there's some large players in the Australian economy, such as the Reserve Bank and Commonwealth Bank of Australia, in addition to New South Wales, and then some other large companies such as PwC, IBM, and R3. But then there's this one company here, Remit, which many have probably never heard of, but this was actually the original name for Quant Network, believe it or not, as we can see right here. Their Twitter page is actually still up, though inactive for anyone who's curious to check it out for themselves. But that's about all we've got for this month's rabbit hole in the world of utility. I hope everyone got something good out of it, whatever it may be. And as usual, have fun diving through the rest of this report and learning about everything there is to these markets. And until next time, guys, stay safe and keep learning. Peace.